Hello and welcome back. It is Monday. I am Mr. Sosotris, and this week we're finishing up Homer's Odyssey. We're going to be talking about the homecoming section, the finale of it, and looking onward to kind of what happens to these characters after in the tradition. So let's get into it. All right, so where are we in the story? So Odysseus has lost all of his men. He was marooned on Calypso's island for 7 years. The gods finally took pity on him and helped him escape. Poseidon did take offense at that, but he did make it to the Phaeacians, or the Phaeacians island, and was welcomed. There's the Princess Nausicaa there. He had a great time. They gave him a ton of treasure, more so than he would have gotten from his conquest of Troy. And he washes up on the beach in Ithaca, and we kind of go from there. So the first kind of overall topic that I wanted to talk about is, why is Odysseus so secretive at first? He doesn't reveal his identity. He is very cagey about who he is. Why doesn't he just march into his home and say, the rightful king has returned, I'm reclaiming my position, and then, that's that. It's because that's not what would happen. So ancient Greece was a lot more dangerous in terms of holding power and maintaining it, especially on Ithaca, because the way Ithaca is described, it's very out of the way, and it would be difficult for a lot of his allies to kind of support him. For example, I'm thinking, Menelaus in Sparta. He wouldn't be able to help defend Odysseus' island from Sparta, and he wouldn't really be able to send enough people over to Ithaca and still kind of maintain his own position, because the people who were in charge of the various kind of city-states, I guess, they were only in power if they could maintain that power. So if they had an army, if they had resources, that kind of thing. It was all about, like, if they were perceived as weak, then other people could sweep in and take over the island or the city or whatever and just oust them. Like, there really wasn't any kind of law of the land. There wasn't a unified Greece, so there wasn't like a Greek central government that would sort of maintain control over everything. It was sort of everyone for themselves, and Menelaus's position is fairly stable because he has a decent sized army, he's decently wealthy, the space that he occupies is much larger. Ithaca is very small, and so if Odysseus just showed up and said, hey, I'm home, I'm reclaiming my throne, all is good, you all can go home because Penelope's not marrying anyone, they could, like, all the suitors could just rise up against him and kill him, because he would have no army at his back, it would be just him. There's so much precariousness. At the beginning of the Odyssey, we see that it's really getting close to the breaking point. It's very clear that any day now there's going to be some kind of conflict. It's all going to just go up in flames, and Penelope is doing her best to sort of delay it, but there isn't really much she can do. So when Odysseus arrives, he does have all the treasure that the Phaeacians give him, which is great, but treasure isn't an army, and he really would have needed an army. So if he had all of his men with him, he probably could have just shown up with everyone and said, okay, we're taking over back from the suitors, kind of thing, because he would have had that fighting force to support him. Now, the other thing is that Telemachus does have a claim to the throne, and so we're saying, why doesn't Telemachus just say, I'm gonna just, we're gonna declare my father dead, I'm gonna claim the throne, and I will just rule Ithaca, because he had the claim to do that. But again, Telemachus doesn't have the power to reinforce that position. There are other men his age on the island, but they would be about his age, because they would have been sort of the sons of the people who left to go fight in Troy, the sons who have kind of then been growing up. So they would have all been fairly young, fairly inexperienced, hardly like a fighting force. They could maybe learn some things, but they wouldn't really be that powerful enough. If he really wanted to, he could make an attempt to take back power with, the support of the few people that he had, but it would be really difficult to maintain that power, especially because they're on an island, and you'd have to defend both from the people there, the suitors, and also people attacks from the sea. And then the other option is if Penelope chooses one of the suitors and says, fine, I'll choose someone, I'll marry him, surely all the rest of the suitors would then leave. There would be a power struggle, and I should say the reason why everyone wants to marry Penelope, because this is hardly a super powerful vast kingdom like Sparta is, but it was a very strategic position. Claire North's Ithaca does a really good job, and I mean there is some artistic license there, but the way she portrays it is that Ithaca is sort of an essential waypoint between sort of the mainstream kind of Greek area and then the rest of the Mediterranean. And so ships would pass through it. It's an important strategic port, basically. And also, a lot of the suitors think that she has gold and wealth and everything, and so they want that. There's nothing really in Homer about how much wealth Ithaca has. It's clear that she's running out of money because she's having to sort of taking care of the suitors, and so if there is a treasury, it's getting low. But if Penelope marries a suitor, all the other suitors are then going to sort of challenge that suitor's claim to rule Ithaca, because they all want control of Ithaca. And so even if she just picks someone, even if she picks the most powerful one, none of the suitors are really that powerful, that like enough that they could fully defend Ithaca against everyone else. So the suitors don't really realize this. They're very short-sighted. They just think, if I can just get Penelope to marry me, surely I can defeat everyone else and it'll be fine. But regardless of who she chooses, it's going to be civil war, basically. And if it isn't, then someone else is going to then take over. Someone from another kingdom can just invade Ithaca and take over if they think that the rulership isn't strong enough. Right now, it's a very tenuous position. And also, if Penelope marries one of the suitors, they would either kill Telemachus or they would exile him, because they want to get him out of the way, because he does have a valid claim to the throne. And if they exile him, maybe he'd go off and get killed, but he might also raise an army somewhere else and come back and reclaim Ithaca, for himself. And so they don't want that. So most likely Telemachus would be killed. So no matter what happens, it's going to be bad for everyone. So there is no good resolution to the issue of the suitors that can be done diplomatically. So when Odysseus arrives back, he has to plan things very, very carefully. He has to assess what's going on. He has to see kind of what's going on with who's most powerful, who is where, how many suitors there are. That's why he doesn't reveal his identity. It's very important that he doesn't reveal his identity until the very last minute, because if he announces it too soon, the suitors could organize against him, and it's just him versus all of them, and so he wouldn't survive that. And so Athena is able to help Odysseus. She disguises him, and he's able to sort of sneak in, and he's disguised as like a beggar man, and so he sneaks in and he's able to sort of get a lay of the land. Him and Telemachus are able to hide all of the weaponry in such a place where they could sort of reach it themselves, but the suitors wouldn't know about it, kind of thing. So once he's able to sort of plan ahead, then he's able to finally confront the suitors and take them out. And it is just him and Telemachus, but they do have Athena helping them out, and she is amazing. But the two of them do manage ultimately to kind of kill all the suitors and take back Ithaca, which is great. And I love the whole sequence. I think it's book 21. It's just carnage. It's just so much fun, because like you almost want to have there be like a musical sequence with like holding out for a hero playing while Odysseus and Telemachus just mow through all the suitors, because it's like this release of tension through that has been building throughout the whole poem. We've had adventures, we've had everything else, but this is kind of the moment when they reclaim their home, and it's the way Homer describes it is just wonderful. It's just chaos and carnage, and it's fun in a very campy kind of satisfying way. I'm thinking of like the Crazy 88 scene in Kill Bill Volume 1 where they eventually have to like go to black and white just so that like there's so much blood everywhere that they have to, because they didn't want to, upset the censors or anything. So it just gets over the top nuts and violent and ridiculous, and it's very satisfying to the readers, even though what's happening on the page is horrifying. Like, it's just mass murder of all these guys, but they're really bad guys and they're dangerous, and this is kind of the only way it can happen. And so why not have just a carnage filled just kill fest? I don't know, maybe I'm just a bad person, but it's a very fun chapter and it's very satisfying. So anyways, let's move on to after the suitors are killed. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is something that Homer scholars have never really been able to fully agree on, and there's clues in the text that support either position, and that is, does Penelope recognize Odysseus when he comes back? Because it changes our interpretation of how things play out depending on which side we fall on. There's nothing wrong with arguing either side because they're both kind of equally supported by the text, but it's a fun thing to debate. So I read one article years ago, and this was in college. I was writing an article about this very topic. It was whether or not Penelope recognized him, and I found this great source, and they argued that yes, she does recognize him. She sets up the bow and axes trial specifically so that she can get the bow into his hands, so she can get him a weapon so he can start taking care of the suitors. Because as soon as he strings the bow and gets the arrow through all the holes in the axes, the first thing he does after that is he shoots Antinous, who's kind of the head suitor. He shoots him and then shoots a couple others, and then it's just carnage after that. But there's other scholars who don't really agree, and I think Homer, the way he sets it up, the way we read it, is that Penelope doesn't recognize Odysseus at all, and she's sort of suspicious of him even after he reveals his name. So they think that when she sets up the bow and axes trial, she's doing it for a number of reasons. Either she's given up and she says, fine, whoever can do this can marry me. Others say that she does it specifically to foster animosity between the suitors because she wants them to sort of become competitive with one another and start like attacking each other, because if they can start killing each other off, that would deflect from her own issues. So that's another option. There's others that say that she doesn't recognize him at all, and the bow and axes trial is just another delaying tactic, kind of like the shroud that she was weaving for Laertes. And so it's hard to say, but according to many people, she doesn't recognize him, and then she was only kind of able to sort of realize that it's him at the very, very end when she tests him with the bed, because she tells someone to move their marriage bed, and Odysseus kind of gets angry because he reveals that the bed was carved into a tree, a very big tree that's like rooted into the ground, so you can't move it. You literally can't move it at all. And he carved it himself, and only he would know that, and so that's kind of what ultimately reveals to her that it is him, and he is home and everything's fine. There's kind of elements of this that don't really make sense to us, but the way you would see it is that the reason why the hospitality culture was so strong is because the gods could just show up as, disguised as a mortal person, and you had to be kind to every guest, because you never know if one of them is going to be a god in disguise. Because if you are mean to a guest and it turns out that they're a god, they would take revenge on you, and that would be really, really bad. And so there's some that say that even if Penelope sort of kind of recognized Odysseus, she might think that he was a god in disguise. Maybe it was a test of her loyalty or something, and so that's why she's sort of suspicious right up until the end. We do get a few insights into her kind of internal mindset early on, and it does seem like she's sort of given up hope that Odysseus will ever return. There's not a lot, but we do have a few moments where it seems like she's literally grieving his loss. She doesn't think he'll ever come back, and there's a cat. Hello, kitty. And she doesn't really believe that he's ever going to come back. So that's something else to think about. There's others that say that she sort of is holding out hope at first, but then starts to kind of lose hope as things go on. And so by the end, even after, all the suitors have been killed, she doesn't really think that it's him. She thinks it must have been a god, and there's really no way that he could have ever come back. Even if she was holding out hope earlier, ultimately she just doesn't believe it. And so when he finally reveals that it is in fact him, it's a big surprise for her. So what do I think? Because this is, it's very much, there's things in the text that support lots of different readings of it. And I think that's why people like the Odyssey so much, is because there's this ambiguity to it. And so when you adapt it for like film or like Epic the Musical or, anything else, there's lots of wiggle room for how you want to present the story. So I think that even if she thinks that he might be a god at first, she would have recognized him, and that the bow and axes thing was a way for her to get a weapon into his hands. And that's just me, because I like Penelope and I think she's a really cool character. But we do have one clue that kind of supports this. And so Eurycleia, who's the nurse, she recognizes Odysseus even before she sees the scar on his thigh that sort of ultimately reveals who he is. But she mentions a couple times, she's like, you kind of look like Odysseus. And so it's clear from that reaction that Athena's disguise isn't like a full-on, he's wearing someone else's face. She must have just added sort of things to conceal his features, but she didn't change anything about how he looked. Maybe she gave him a larger beard, maybe she made his eyes kind of hollow and sunken, and, kind of changed what was already there a little bit. But she didn't like give him someone else's face entirely. If she'd done that, Eurycleia wouldn't have recognized him. So the fact that we know that Eurycleia recognizes him means that he does kind of resemble Odysseus, and that you would only recognize him if you knew what to look for. So the suitors don't really recognize him at all. They just think he's a beggar guy, and they're very mean to him. But Penelope would have recognized him if he did kind of look like Odysseus, because it would have been something. It would have been 20 years since she's seen him, and so it would have been kind of difficult for her to maybe accept it first. But I do think that she did recognize who he is, and that's why she sets things up so that he ends up with the weapon and is able to take out the suitors. Also, the thing with the bow, because only Odysseus could have strung his bow, and he strings it really easily. They describe it. It's not like he has to sort of struggle and gets it. He strings it like immediately, no concern. But the suitors, none of them are able to string the bow, because the way it's shaped is, it's kind of hard to say, but I can put a picture of it up on here. But the bow, instead of it just being like bows when you think of nowadays, it would just be like a straight kind of thing, and then you hook the top to the bottom, and that bends the bow, and then that's what gives you the power. This bow was sort of curved away, and so you would have to not only just turn it, but you'd have to like curve it completely around to connect the string. So it was a very powerful bow, and it was designed in such a way that it would have been very difficult to string. And so I think giving him the bow might have been a part of her trying to decide if he was who he was. But ultimately, when he strings it, she knows who it is. And then the thing with the bed later, I think that is just, she's trying to test him to see how committed he is to their relationship. And so when she mentions the bed, this is just my interpretation of it. When she mentions the bed, she wants to see how passionate he feels about something that sort of represents their union, something that he made for her. And so his reaction to that would tell her a lot about how he feels about her. If he was sort of dismissive of it, or if he was sort of casual about it, then maybe she thought maybe he wasn't as interested in her anymore. Maybe he'd been unfaithful, and he had 2 relationships on his way home. And as I mentioned last time, he didn't really have a lot of decision making in that. But I think the test with the bed was Penelope seeing just how much Odysseus still cared about their relationship. So that's just me, but you can argue otherwise. There's other ways to interpret that. Either way, their reunion is really satisfying, and it's coming after the amazing slaughter of the suitors. This is sort of the emotional, the circle is complete sort of moment. They come together, they sleep together. It's their reunion is genuinely really good. They're not super hyper emotional until kind of right at the end, but it's still a really good moment. They have this sort of, they're together again, they're a united force, and all is good. So finally, before I go into anything like the conclusion stuff, I wanted to talk about sort of what was meant to happen after the Odyssey. So the Iliad and the Odyssey are part of what's called the epic cycle, and it's a collection of epic poems, not all by Homer, there's some by other writers, but it was sort of meant to sort of tell one sort of continuous story, and it's kind of like the first cinematic universe, and that's really cheesy, but the epic cycle anyways. And so after the Odyssey, there was supposed to be another poem. It's a shorter poem, and it's called the Telegony, and it was sort of a sequel to the Odyssey, and it sort of showed what happened afterward. We don't have the poem itself, like we don't really have anything of it except for maybe 2 lines, but what we do have is a summary of the poem that showed up in another source. So someone is writing about Greek literature, and he was able to get a hold of it somehow, and so he wrote a summary of it. And this is another ancient source, and so that source, we have that, but we don't have the source that he had, so it's kind of sad. There's lots of lost ancient Greek art, and it just makes me sad. There's like missing plays by Sophocles and Euripides that we're never going to see ever because they've just been lost to time, and that just hurts me. But when you hear about what's in the Telegony, you might change your mind about that. So the Telegony is sort of a 2-part poem. So there's one part that shows, it starts kind of right when the Odyssey ends, and in the Odyssey, when Odysseus meets Tiresias sort of tells him a bit about his future. He tells him of sort of a sacrifice that he has to make, and he tells him that his death is going to come from the ocean when he's quite old. And so this follows where he's trying to sort of fulfill the terms of Tiresias's prediction. And he travels to a place called Thesprotia, and he's going to make he's going to make sacrifices there to kind of fulfill his destiny. While he's there, he marries the queen. Her name is Calidice, I think is how you pronounce it. And yes, he marries the queen. Penelope is back in Ithaca, but he marries his queen. They have a son together, and he fights in a conflict where her kingdom, Thesprotia, is being attacked by a rival nation. And so he fights to defend his new home, and the gods get involved in that conflict. Ares is sort of fighting on the side of the other people. Athena is fighting on his side. Apollo joins in and sort of is able to kind of ultimately quell the fighting. But in this conflict, the queen, Calidice, is killed, and so Odysseus kind of takes their son together, and puts him on the throne, and then he returns back to Ithaca. It's just like, well, my other wife died, and so my son is now king over there, and I'm going to come back to Ithaca. Okay. And then we flash over to Circe's island, where it turns out she had a son with Odysseus as well, and his name is Telegonus. I think I pronounced that right. And so he learns about his father, I think from Athena. Athena tells him about who his father is, and he wants to go meet him. And so Circe gives him an enchanted spear, and the spear point is made from kind of a poisonous stingray spine, so it's kind of a magical spear. She gives it to him to kind of defend himself because she's worried. I don't know how old he is at this point. He's like maybe Telemachus's age, maybe a little bit older. And so he comes back to Ithaca. There's a storm. He sort of washes up on the shore with his ship, but he doesn't really know where he is because he got lost in the storm. And so for whatever reason, he sees Odysseus's cattle. He thinks he's on some other island and says, oh, well, I guess we're just going to be a pirate. And so he starts rounding up this cattle that he finds and is just going to steal it while he travels onward because, that's what you do. But Odysseus did the same thing when they arrived on Polyphemus's island. He sees all the sheep there, or the goats, no, sheep, and is like, well, we'll just take some. So they just take a bunch, and then he goes into to Polyphemus's cave, and things go bad from there. But Telegonus arrives on Ithaca, and he's rounding up these cattle, and Odysseus shows up, and he's like, you weirdo, what are you doing? You're taking my cows. And so they have a conflict, and Telegonus stabs Odysseus with the magic spear. And so right before Odysseus dies, they recognize each other. Telegonus is horrified to realize he's killed his own father, and he takes Penelope and Telemachus back to Circe's island, Aea, and they bury Odysseus there, and then Telemachus marries Circe, and Telegonus marries Penelope, which is like, that's Odysseus' son marrying Odysseus' widow. So, okay, fun times. It was another time, I guess. And so this poem is lost, and I'm kind of glad it's lost, because it's just, it doesn't have any of the grandeur or sweep of any of the other kind of elements. There are other poems in the epic cycle. I think there's one called the Little Iliad, and I think that one contains the Trojan horse thing, but that one again is sort of mostly lost. And so all we have about the Trojan horse from that time is sort of the account that we hear of it in the Odyssey when Telemachus is visiting Menelaus. So there's other stuff as well. Now there's another version of the story that comes from Aristotle, so that's much, much later. And he said that Telemachus ultimately leaves Ithaca and he marries Nausicaa of the Phaeacians, which makes a lot more sense. Nausicaa is great. She was sort of a princess who was around his age, maybe a little bit older, but she was at least an appropriate age for him. And he doesn't ever become king of Ithaca, but he does end up with Nausicaa. I think I like that version better. Aristotle was a bit of a stodgy guy, but I'll hand it to him that he did come up with a good idea when he kind of posited this idea of this, or this version of the story. Now, in a much, much, much later tradition, we're now in like Romantic era England, you've got Tennyson, who wrote a poem called Ulysses. Ulysses is the Roman name for Odysseus, it's the Latin name. Where, and this is very romantic, but it's Odysseus having returned home, is sort of restless because he misses, being out there and wandering the world. And so he hands the kingdom over to Telemachus, and then he kind of leaves and just goes off to sort of wander for the rest of his days. It's, if you've read Tennyson, that's very much his bag. It's a great poem if you want to read it. It's really good. Tennyson's great. I love him as much as I make fun of him because I love the Romantic poets, but it's not something the Greeks, I think, would necessarily relate to. They wanted their heroes to either go out in a blaze of glory or sort of accomplish something really great in their later days, not just sort of wandering. Now, going over to Penelope, there's some other sources as well. Now, there's an earlier source before the Odyssey, before Homer, that says that Penelope was the mother of the god Pan, and it was either with Apollo or Hermes, depending on, I think Apollodorus says it was Hermes, and there's a couple other ones. So I think Hermes is the more common kind of version of it, but and that says that, she was the father of Pan, and I believe that happened while Odysseus was away, maybe, but Pan, is sort of a very wild nature god, and he's very cool, but apparently Penelope in some traditions was his mother. In other traditions it was Hermes and a nymph. I can't remember the nymph's name, but she and him kind of gave birth to Pan. So either way, it's probably Hermes. Good old Hermes, he does that. But anyways, Penelope is kind of an odd character because there's kind of other versions of what happened to her. There's one where, and I can't remember where this one comes from, but I think it's later, but it says that when Odysseus comes back, he discovers that she's been unfaithful to him, and he banishes her to like some faraway island Maybe that's the island where she ultimately meets Hermes. Who knows? But I don't know. I don't really like that version of the story. But again, when it comes to sort of what's the correct version, there really is no answer, because mythology was an oral tradition. Everyone had their own variations, and it was okay that there was different variations. There wasn't like a set central version of all the stories, and it might have some variation here and there, but it could be held up against kind of the gold standard main version of the story. That's not really how it was. It was very much a time of remakes and sequels, just like today. So everyone kind of wanted to do their own version of the story, and so there's lots of different versions of it. And it was kind of like, it was just like different cities would have sort of their preferred version, maybe. But again, there was no central version of any of these stories. So all of these variations of what happened to Telemachus after, what happened to Odysseus, it's all up to interpretation. Madeline Miller in Circe, she kind of she uses a bit from the Telegony, and she does include the thing about Telegonus stabbing Odysseus accidentally with the spear, the sea spine spear. There's a really cool sequence where we see her kind of getting the spear. It's very cool. That's a great book if you haven't read it. It's one of my favorites. But so lots of authors are able to sort of take all these different versions and sort of combine them together, pick the elements of them that they like, and throw away the elements that they don't like. And so that's what everyone's been doing since the dawn of time. So every version of the Odyssey is completely valid. Even Epic the Musical, people make fun of it because it's sort of aimed at a younger audience, but it's still a valid interpretation of the story, because it's a tradition. You're supposed to sort of reinvent the story and remake it and everything. So the Greeks would have loved superhero movies, because superhero movies and just comics and the superhero genre in general is very much an outgrowth of that kind of heroic mythology tradition. And so if you'd ask someone, who is the correct Spider-Man, for example, is it Tobey Maguire or Tom Holland or Andrew Garfield? The answer is all of them. Like, they're all valid interpretations of the story. There's 3 different continuities of the story, and then you've got all the comics, and then you've got all the variations in the comics, and that's very much in line with the tradition of mythology, where everyone has their own kind of version, and it's okay. There is no central canon. There is no sort of definitive version of Spider-Man, just like there's no definitive version of Odysseus. We do have the Odyssey, but if you wanted to do a remake of the Odyssey and change things around, you're free to do that, because it's not set in stone. It's an oral tradition, and what counts is that the story's passed on in whatever form is most able to be passed on. So, it's all good. So before I go, I do want to leave you with 2 questions. You can either try answering them down in the comments or just think about them on your own. So, do you believe that Penelope recognized Odysseus? And so I want you to find what clues in the text support your position. And there's stuff that'll support either one. So what details from the poem support your position of whether or not she recognized him or not? The next question is Odysseus truly a heroic character? He's done a lot of things. What things has he done in the Odyssey that sort of leads you to come to that conclusion? Is he really a hero? Is he sort of an accidental hero? Is he a heroic person? Is he someone we should look up to? What is kind of your ultimate opinion of him? I know Epic the Musical has sort of one opinion of him. The Odyssey certainly supports that he's a heroic character, but you could argue many different interpretations of the character. There's enough ambiguity in the text that, and I think that's what makes Odysseus so interesting. Even the beginning, the first line of the poem, "Tell me, muse of the man of many ways." So, and I think Emily Wilson translates that as a complicated man. So Odysseus is a complicated, complex person. It's hard to say if he's heroic or not, but you could argue that he is. You could also argue that he's not heroic. And so think about what things are in this that support your opinion of him. And I think that's why people like him, because he's kind of a complicated man. He's a man of many ways. And so there's different ways you can look at him. So with that said, I will let you go. I'm going to be starting on the Aeneid soon. I'm not going to be jumping into it right away. I'm going to be doing, I think maybe it'll be next month when I start that. I'm reading Claire North's Songs of Penelope trilogy right now. I'm still on the first book. And so once I'm done with that, I think I'll jump into the Aeneid. So until then, I'll be doing other bookish stuff in the meantime. So with that said, I will let you go. I will see you next week. And in the meantime, happy reading. Bye.